Ruth Whitmore sat at the last round table, where the light softened into amber and the music never quite reached at full volume. The ballroom on Meeting Street glittered with crystal and gold, a Charleston evening dressed to impress. Servers slipped between tables with practiced grace. Laughter rose in bright ribbons near the stage, where a towering cake waited beneath a cascade of white orchids. It was Caroline's night, the 35th birthday she had planned for months, and everything about the room announced status. The guest list, the camera flashes, the careful way people said the Harrington name. Ruth kept her hands folded in her lap to hide the tremor. She wore a navy dress she had saved for, simple and neat, with a strand of pearls that used to belong to her mother. From where she sat, Caroline looked incandescent, a fitted sapphire gown, hair swept back, a microphone already in her hand. At the foot of the stage stood Patricia Harrington, poised, immaculate, smiling as if the room were a mirror built to flatter her. The MC finished a few warm jokes and invited Caroline up. A hush settled, the kind Charleston knows how to create, polite, expectant, watchful. Caroline leaned into the microphone, thanked sponsors and friends, thanked her husband, Edward, whose smile seemed to hover just behind her shoulder. Then she turned toward Patricia, voice sweet and steady. "She has guided me in ways I can never repay," Caroline said, opening her arms. "She taught me grace. She taught me presence. She taught me how to be the woman I am." She beckoned Patricia to join her. When the older woman reached the stage, Caroline wrapped her in a practiced embrace and lifted the mic again. "This," she said, with a brightness that carried to the back row, "is the only mother that matters to me." Applause broke like sudden rain. Cameras popped. Someone whistled. Several guests rose to their feet. The spotlights widened until the stage glowed like a small sun. At the last table, Ruth felt the sound land on her like gravel. For a second, she thought the words must have bent on the way to her. Misheard, misdirected. Then Caroline angled her body, eyes searching the dim edges of the room until they found her. "You can leave now," Caroline said, not into the microphone, but not softly either. Enough people near Ruth heard. Enough turned. Ruth stood because there was no graceful way to remain seated. She smoothed her skirt and lifted her chin. The pearls were cool against her throat. She wished they were heavier. She wished they could weigh her to the floor. The nearest couple shifted their chairs to make room. One woman murmured an apology that wasn't hers to make. Ruth nodded toward no one and everyone, the way a person nods to weather. She made it 3 steps. A sharp scrape of a chair echoed to her left. Julia Harrington, Edward's sister, rose from a table midroom, the kind of table that had been placed where the cameras would pass often. Julia's dress was simple black, nothing to catch the light, but something in her face did. She reached the stage with quick, light strides, a hand already out. Caroline, surprised, surrendered the microphone without meaning to. It was an old habit between them, Caroline offering, Julia receiving, and on any other night it would have been harmless. "Wait," Julia said. One word, clear enough to still the applause that lingered like static. The band's pianist lifted his hands from the keys. "This is Caroline's birthday," Julia continued, voice steadying. "And yes, we should celebrate the woman she's become. But celebration without truth is performance." She glanced toward the back, toward Ruth, not long enough to embarrass her, just long enough to locate the damage. Everyone in this room knows kindness when they see it. Everyone here knows generosity. And everyone here knows where Caroline learned to stand up straight when life made her small. Patricia's smile thinned. Caroline's lips parted, a flock of words catching at once. "Julia," she warned. Julia did not look at her. "Ruth Whitmore," she said, more to the room than to the woman at the back. "Paid for music lessons when there was no money left over." She sat up with fevers. She lived quiet, so Caroline could be loud. If tonight is about gratitude, then the truth has to be bigger than our table assignments. A low murmur moved through the guests, the sound people make when a script slips. Cameras lowered. Several heads turned fully toward Ruth, as if she had only now become visible. Caroline stepped forward, hand out. "Give me the mic." Julia held it tighter. Her voice cooled. "You don't dismiss your mother from a room she built you to enter," she said. "Not in this city. Not in any." Silence followed, a real silence, not the polite kind. Ruth felt it spread through the hall, felt it settle on the orchids, on the crystal, on the balanced little world Caroline and Patricia had arranged for the evening. It was the kind of silence that arrives just before the first crack in glass makes itself known. Ruth did not move. The exit was still behind her. The stage was still ahead. Between them, the room held its breath, and something old in her stopped trembling. Whatever this night had been designed to prove, it had already failed. A line had been drawn, not loudly but cleanly. The party would find its volume again. The pianist would touch the keys. The servers would resume their gentle orbit. But the air had shifted. Everyone felt it. Ruth raised her chin a fraction higher and stayed where she was. As if standing in the doorway of a storm she finally intended to watch pass. Ruth remained where she stood, the air of the ballroom still pressing against her skin. But her mind, without asking permission, slipped backward into years she had spent trying not to revisit. It happened the way memory often does. Quietly at first, then with a force that felt like a hand closing around her heart. She had been 8 the first time she learned what real fear looked like. Her father's anger had been loud, unrestrained, a thunder that rolled through their small house in Beaufort. Her mother had been gentle but fragile, bones too light for the weight of his fists or his words. Ruth remembered curling beneath the table during those nights, pressing her palms to her ears, wishing the world would go silent. Love had been something whispered between apologies, tenderness a rare guest, safety a miracle. She grew up believing she would never have a child because she did not trust the world to give a child softness. But life, in its small mercies, surprised her. When Caroline was born, Ruth held her so close the nurses laughed. She whispered to the wrinkled, wailing bundle, "You won't live the life I lived. I promise you that." It was a vow not spoken to God, but to herself, and she guarded it more fiercely than any prayer. Caroline grew like a beam of sunlight, bright, curious, affectionate. She followed Ruth everywhere, tugging the hem of her dress, asking questions, demanding to be spun in circles. Every night before bed, she wrapped her small arms around Ruth's neck and declared, without hesitation, "You're the best mom in the world." And Ruth, who had never known what it felt like to be held that tightly, always believed her. For a while their home was warm, imperfect but peaceful. That peace ended the day John Whitmore, Caroline's father, began to let the world grind him down. His job at the shipyard had worn him into a man made of sighs and sharp words. He didn't hit. He didn't scream. He simply looked at Ruth as though she were made of dust, and the look alone was enough to rearrange the atmosphere of the house. It started subtly. At dinner one night, Caroline, 6 years old, swinging her legs under the chair, scrunched her nose at the casserole Ruth had made. "Daddy says you overcook everything," she announced, pushing her plate away. Ruth smiled lightly, the way mothers do when their hearts take a hit. "Well, Daddy likes things crisp," she replied, but inside something tightened. Not because of the dish, because it wasn't Caroline's voice, it was John's, borrowed and softened, but unmistakable. Soon there were more moments, little cuts disguised as childish honesty. At a park play date, Caroline ran to join her friends, only to turn and call out, "Mom, don't stand too close. You're embarrassing when you hover." Ruth stepped back. She had never hovered. On another afternoon, when Ruth brought cupcakes to Caroline's class, her daughter thanked her without meeting her eyes, as though kindness were a chore she no longer had time for. When her friends giggled about Ruth's outdated cardigan, Caroline laughed with them. Not loudly, but enough. Ruth tried to blame adolescence, peer pressure, mood swings. But the truth was quieter and clearer. Caroline had begun to adopt the lens through which her father viewed the world. And in that lens, Ruth was small, overly gentle, unsophisticated, a woman without edges. John never told Caroline to disrespect her mother. He simply modeled indifference, and children learn by imitation. Caroline watched the way he dismissed Ruth's opinions with a sigh, or slipped out of rooms when she spoke too long. She noticed how he praised precision, logic, ambition, things Ruth had never had the luxury to cultivate in her own stormy childhood. Caroline absorbed these lessons quickly. Ruth saw it happen, but didn't know how to stop it. She only knew how to love, and sometimes love is too quiet to compete with the world. In middle school, the shift sharpened. Caroline became bolder in her judgments. When Ruth tried to help with homework, her daughter corrected her grammar. When Ruth bought a dress for a school event, Caroline asked why it looked so plain. And when they argued, Caroline delivered the line that lodged itself deep in Ruth's chest. Dad says you get emotional because you don't understand things. That night, Ruth cried in the bathroom with the faucet running, old habits from old wounds. She told herself Caroline didn't mean it. She told herself children say things they don't understand. But somewhere inside, the truth whispered, she's learning to see you the way your father once did. Caroline grew older, taller, sharper. Ruth stayed the same soft shape she had always been. And slowly, mother and daughter stopped meeting in the middle, until eventually there was no middle left. And standing now in the Charleston ballroom, beneath chandeliers heavy with light, Ruth realized something she had never allowed herself to think. Her daughter had not changed overnight. The cruelty at the microphone had been planted long ago, watered by silence, shaped by influence, taught by example. Tonight was just the harvest. There were many kinds of silence in Ruth's life, but the ones that lived between her and Caroline were the most dangerous, the soft, creeping kind that didn't look like cruelty but felt like slow suffocation. Talking could wound, yes, but silence could starve. Silence could erase. When Caroline turned 16, that silence found its first true foothold. It happened one evening in their small dining room, the table set simply with roasted chicken, green beans, and the sheet music Ruth had placed beside Caroline's plate. Music had always been their shared corner of the world. Piano lessons after school, weekend practice sessions, recitals where Caroline scanned the crowd until she spotted her mother's face. But adolescence had begun to stretch her in new directions, and Ruth could feel it. She just didn't know how permanent it would become. That night, Ruth gently suggested Caroline continue her lessons. "You have real talent," she said, "and you used to love it." Caroline didn't answer immediately. She pushed her beans around with her fork, waiting. Ruth realized later, for John to speak first. When he did, his tone was blunt. "She doesn't need music. It's a waste of time if she's serious about her future." Caroline lifted her eyes and aligned herself with his certainty. "Dad's right," she said, shoulders tightening. "You don't understand. Music isn't important." Ruth smiled softly, trying to keep the sting from her face. "Honey, it doesn't have to be important to everyone. It just has to matter to you." Caroline's reply came quick, sharper than she seemed to intend. "See, you don't get it. You never get it." The room thinned around Ruth. She folded the sheet music and placed it aside, her fingertips trembling on the page. She didn't argue. She didn't plead. She simply let the silence expand, hoping it would cushion instead of crush. But silence rarely cushions. It records, and it teaches. That night became the blueprint for all the years that followed. As Caroline grew older, more polished, more ambitious. The silence between them grew too. It wasn't the loud rejection of childhood tantrums. It was cooler, cleaner, practiced. In the mornings, a quiet nod instead of a greeting. After school, headphones instead of conversation. At dinner, eyes on the phone, not on her mother. And Ruth, hoping not to push her daughter further away, matched that silence with her own. She thought she was giving space. She didn't realize she was giving ground. Everything changed again when Caroline met Edward Harrington. He was polite, well-dressed, the kind of young man Charleston families approved of, steady, composed, from a lineage that carried its name the way one carried heirloom silver. But it was his mother, Patricia Harrington, who altered the course of Ruth's bond with her daughter. Patricia was magnetic in a quiet, curated way. She complemented Caroline's intelligence, her ambition, her charm, all the things Caroline had learned to value most. She invited her to luncheons, introduced her to people with last names that opened doors, praised her choices with deliberate warmth. And little by little, Caroline began turning toward Patricia for guidance. First in small ways. What do you think of this dress? Patricia recommends this book. Patricia knows the best places in Mount Pleasant. Then in ways that carved Ruth out entirely. I'll ask Patricia. She always knows what to do. Patricia says I should aim higher. Patricia thinks I need more discipline. Ruth never fought Patricia for space. She told herself it was normal for young women to look up to older, successful figures. She told herself she didn't need to compete. But competition wasn't necessary, patience alone was enough. Patricia filled every quiet space Ruth had stepped back from. After the wedding, the shift became unmistakable. Caroline stopped inviting Ruth to fittings, dinners, charity events, business gatherings, the very occasions she never missed with the Harringtons. Photos appeared online. Caroline with Patricia at luncheons, at terrace gardens, at galas, always linked arm in arm as if they had long been tied by blood instead of convenience. Ruth received the pictures secondhand, through acquaintances who meant well but didn't understand the weight of their well-meaning. Look how radiant Caroline is next to her mother-in-law. She looks just like Patricia, same poise. In phone calls, Caroline's voice carried a new edge. We're hosting a dinner, but it's mostly Edward's colleagues. It's just a small thing. You wouldn't enjoy it. It's formal. You'd feel out of place. In person, the transformation was even sharper. Caroline greeted Ruth with a polite, distant smile, the smile people reserve for neighbors or former teachers, not mothers. At family dinners, she directed conversation toward Patricia. When Ruth spoke, Caroline listened with the kind of distracted patience adults give children who chatter about things that don't matter. The silence that grew between them was no longer accidental. It had purpose. It pushed Ruth outward 1 inch at a time. One ignored invitation, one cold glance, one quiet dismissal. And like all silences intended to erase, it didn't happen suddenly, it happened steadily, invisibly, until the bond that once felt unbreakable had thinned into something transparent and fragile. In the end, what hurt most wasn't what Caroline said. It was everything she chose not to say. The humiliations did not arrive as storms, at least not at first. They came the way erosion comes. Slowly, quietly, shaving away pieces of Ruth's dignity until she no longer recognized the shape of herself. What had begun as subtle distance hardened into patterns, and those patterns became wounds she learned to carry without letting them show. The first cut came at Caroline's high school graduation. It was an evening Ruth had imagined for years. Crisp June air, the stadium lights glowing soft and warm, students in navy gowns moving like a tide across the field. Ruth had dressed carefully, choosing a pale blue blouse because Caroline once said it was the color that made her look kind. She arrived early, saved a seat near the aisle, clutching the small bouquet she had bought even though money had been tight. When Caroline's row was called to the stage, Ruth stood with her phone ready, heart swelling. Caroline walked confidently, chin high, the tassel brushing her cheek. Ruth extended her free hand as her daughter approached the steps, a gesture so instinctive she didn't think about it. Just a mother's hand reaching for the child she raised. But Caroline glanced at her, just briefly, and shifted her path 2 feet to the right, far enough to avoid any chance of touch. The motion was slight, practiced, almost invisible to anyone else. But Ruth felt it like a physical blow. Caroline accepted her diploma, waved to the crowd, and sought the eyes of her father, then Patricia, who sat with them for the first time that night. Ruth lowered her hand slowly, as though returning a fragile thing to a box. Later, when they joined the crowd outside, Ruth tried to hug her. "Oh, Mom," Caroline murmured, leaning away as if the gesture might wrinkle her gown. "Not now. People are watching." Those 4 words, "people are watching," settled into Ruth's chest like a stone. Months later came the second wound. It happened at a small social gathering Patricia hosted, a garden party meant to introduce Caroline to a circle of Charleston women who valued lineage almost as much as charm. Ruth had been invited as an afterthought, Caroline's +1, though she was her mother. She wore a floral skirt she'd ironed 3 times and brought lemon squares she'd spent the whole morning baking. As Caroline moved through the group with Patricia, Ruth lagged gently behind, unsure where she fit. She stepped closer when she heard her daughter say, laughing lightly, "My mom is sweet, but sometimes she can be embarrassing. She gets overwhelmed at events like this." Ruth froze. She didn't approach. She didn't interrupt. She simply stood there, holding the tin of lemon squares like a shield she didn't know how to use. The women in the circle chuckled. Patricia offered a sympathetic pat to Caroline's arm. Ruth waited until the conversation shifted before she slipped backward, pretending she needed fresh air. That evening, Caroline never noticed Ruth had left early. But the deepest wound, the one Ruth carried for years, happened in a kitchen that wasn't her own. By then, Caroline and Edward were married, and the Harrington home in Mount Pleasant had become the axis around which Caroline's new life spun. Ruth tried to visit occasionally, though each visit sharpened her awareness that she no longer belonged. Still, she brought what she could offer: food, small gifts, gentle attempts at connection. One Sunday, she arrived with a peach cobbler she'd baked from an old family recipe. The scent of cinnamon and butter filled the Harrington kitchen as she placed it on the counter. Caroline's smile was tight. "Oh, thanks, Mom. I'll put it in the kitchen." Ruth didn't realize the kitchen meant the second kitchen, the service kitchen behind the dining room, where dishes no guest ever saw were placed. Moments later, as she rounded the hallway, she heard Caroline's voice from the butler's pantry. "Patricia, look at this. I swear she brings these old-fashioned desserts every time. It's so outdated. We'll just keep it back here." Patricia's reply was soft but cutting. "She means well, darling. But she doesn't understand the image you have to maintain." Ruth stepped away before they saw her. She held her hands together tightly, as though pinning her emotions in place. For the rest of the visit, she smiled politely and declined dessert because her cobbler never made it to the table. Humiliations accumulated, small but relentless. A missed invitation here, a dismissive comment there, a glance exchanged between Caroline and Patricia that said more than any words could. With each cut, Ruth told herself a familiar story. Maybe I'm too sensitive. Maybe Caroline is right. Maybe I don't belong in her world anymore. The heartbreaking part wasn't only that Caroline treated her this way. It was that Ruth began to believe she deserved it. She shrank herself to avoid being embarrassing. She stayed quiet to avoid disappointing. She stepped back to give space, not realizing she was stepping out of her daughter's life entirely. And through it all, Caroline drifted further toward Patricia, orbiting her the way a child orbits the sun she believes gives her light. Patricia offered structure, social polish, approval, the tools Caroline thought she needed to rise in the world. And slowly, inevitably, she let that warmth replace the warmth she had once found in her mother's arms. Ruth never accused, never confronted, never competed. But silence, once again, became the weapon fate chose against her. And it hit its mark every time. The house was quiet when Ruth returned from the birthday banquet, the kind of quiet that feels like it's listening. She closed the front door, gently, as though any loud sound might shatter what little strength she had left. Her heels clicked faintly against the hardwood floor as she made her way down the dim hallway to her bedroom. She didn't turn on the overhead light, only the small lamp on her dresser, its soft glow settling over the room like a tired sigh. Ruth stood before the mirror. Her reflection stared back at her. The navy dress wrinkled at the waist, her pearl necklace slightly askew. The faint smear where she'd touched her cheek, trying to hold herself together. But it wasn't her appearance that held her attention. It was the question rising inside her. Quiet but merciless. When did I lose my daughter? She braced her hands on the dresser and let the memories come. Not the gentle ones she used to cling to, but the ones she had spent years pushing down, sealing off, pretending didn't matter. She remembered the sound of the front door slamming when Caroline was 14, the way it rattled the living room windows. Caroline had stormed in after an argument with a friend, dropping her backpack on the floor. She vented to John first, voice sharp, breath fast, then fell silent the moment Ruth approached. When Ruth gently asked what happened, Caroline muttered, "You wouldn't understand," and disappeared into her room, shutting the door with a firmness that made the picture frames shake. It was the first time Ruth had felt truly locked out. She remembered the argument at 17, when she and Caroline clashed over curfews. Caroline's eyes, usually bright and curious, had gone cold with a maturity that didn't belong to her. "You overreact to everything," she had snapped. "Dad says you take everything too personally. Maybe that's why no one listens to you." Ruth had stood still, stunned less by the words than by the tone, flat, dismissive, learned. And she remembered a morning during college application season, when she tried to give Caroline advice about a personal essay. Caroline looked up from her laptop with a polite but distant gaze, the same one she used years later at the ballroom. "Patricia knows what admissions officers want," she had said, closing her computer. "She already helped me rewrite most of it. I'll just stick with her suggestions." Ruth had nodded, swallowing the ache. She told herself not to interfere. She told herself Caroline was growing, changing, finding new influences as young adults do. She told herself silence was support. But now, standing in the faint lamp glow, the truth settled into her with the weight of years. Silence didn't protect me. It erased me. The words formed inside her like a confession finally given voice. She said them once in her mind, then again. Quietly this time, aloud as if testing their truth. "Silence didn't protect me," she whispered. "It erased me." She thought of all the times she had stepped aside, politely, thinking it was love. All the times she had let Caroline's words bruise her, thinking endurance was strength. All the times she watched Patricia slide seamlessly into her place, thinking protesting would make things worse. Every time she stayed quiet, she surrendered another piece of her place in her daughter's life. And tonight, Caroline had taken the final piece and held it up for a room full of strangers to see. The humiliation in the ballroom had felt brutal, but it was the clarity afterward that shocked her. The sudden, slicing understanding that she had not just lost her daughter, she had been slowly removed, one quiet omission at a time. Ruth lifted her chin and looked at her reflection again. Her eyes were tired, yes, but there was something new beneath the exhaustion. Not anger, not bitterness, something steadier, something that had been dormant for too long. Resolve. She inhaled slowly, the breath trembling before it steadied. "No more," she said softly. Not a shout, Not a vow, a boundary, because somewhere between the slamming doors, the cold glances, and the birthday speech meant to shame her, Ruth had reached the end of what silence could forgive. She straightened her necklace, smoothing her dress as if preparing for something. Not another confrontation, not another plea for love, for truth. In the stillness of her bedroom, under the glow of a single warm lamp, Ruth Whitmore made a decision that would change the course of everything that followed. She would no longer disappear. She would no longer shrink. She would no longer stand by while her daughter and Patricia rewrote the story of her life. If Caroline wanted the world to believe Ruth was small, invisible, or unworthy, then Ruth would respond with something sharper than anger. She would respond with clarity, with evidence, with the truth she had been too afraid to speak. The night had taken her dignity, but the morning would give her purpose. Ruth woke before dawn the next morning, long before the sun slid over the marshes behind her house. The sky was still the color of deep water, the quiet so complete she could hear her own pulse in her ears. She moved through the hallway with purpose, though her hands trembled slightly. Grief had hollowed this house in many ways, but it was the room at the end of the hall, the room she had avoided for years, that felt heaviest now. John's study. She hesitated at the doorway. Dust had settled like a thin veil across the bookshelves, and the faint smell of old paper clung to the air. The desk remained exactly as he left it, organized, spare, practical. John had been a man of structure, of ledgers and order, of numbers that behaved the way people never did. After he passed, Ruth never had the heart to enter this room. It felt like trespassing on a memory she hadn't healed from. But now, something stronger than hesitation guided her inside. She opened the blinds and let the faint early light spill across the desk. The drawers, stiff from disuse, creaked as she pulled them open one by one. At first she found the usual things: old invoices, tax statements, handwritten notes for projects long completed. But the bottom drawer on the right, the one John used to lock, stopped her. She knelt, using both hands to ease it open. Inside sat a stack of folders bound with twine, each labeled in John's precise handwriting. She recognized some of the company names, but others were unfamiliar. She lifted the top folder and placed it on the desk, then opened it slowly as though expecting something to leap from the pages. What she saw tightened her breath. Bank transfers, signatures, large sums moving quietly between accounts. Several documents bore the Harrington name, specifically Edward's father, years before he passed. Others showed connections to Patricia, thinly veiled behind shell companies and charitable fronts. There were contracts tucked inside, addendums stapled to the back, clauses that seemed harmless until she understood what they pointed toward: concealed financial ties, hidden payments, reallocated assets. And then, the most damning items: letters of guarantee, bearing Caroline's signature from early in her marriage. Ruth sank into John's old chair, the leather cool beneath her. She read each line slowly, careful not to let shock cloud her understanding. John had known something. He had kept these documents hidden, not out of malice, she now understood, but because revealing them could have destroyed the Harringtons, and, with them, Caroline's life and reputation. But Caroline wasn't a naive girl anymore, and Patricia had long since crossed the line between influence and manipulation. Ruth gathered the folders and went straight to the only person she trusted: Arthur Hale, John's former attorney. His office in downtown Charleston sat above a quiet cafe, the hallway lined with framed degrees and pictures of the city in sepia tones. When she entered, Arthur looked up from his desk, surprise flickering across his features. "Ruth," he said gently, "I haven't seen you in years." "I know," she replied. "I need your help." She laid the folders before him. Arthur adjusted his glasses and began to read. The room was silent except for the occasional rustle of paper and the shifting of his chair. 10 minutes passed. then 15. When he finally sat back, his face had changed, no longer surprised, but grim. "Ruth," he said quietly, "these papers can destroy them." She didn't flinch. "I'm not sure destruction is what I want," she murmured. "But I won't let them destroy me." Arthur leaned forward. "But you have to be smart. These documents, they're dynamite. If you use them, there's no going back." "I know," she said. And she meant it. Back home, Ruth scanned every document meticulously, saving digital copies on a password-protected drive. She printed duplicates and stored them in a sealed envelope beneath the loose floorboard in her bedroom, the same place she once hid Caroline's childhood drawings. It felt strange, replacing innocence with truth. But truth was all she had left. That evening, she stood once again before her bedroom mirror, the same place she'd questioned herself the night before. But now, the reflection looking back at her was steadier. She began to speak aloud, not in anger, not in vengeance, but in clarity. She practiced her opening line, then the next, then the next. She adjusted her posture, straightened her shoulders, lifted her chin. She practiced looking unshaken, even when her voice trembled. She practiced pausing after certain words, letting silence serve her instead of swallowing her. She spoke as though the room were filled with every person who had ever doubted her. Caroline, Patricia, the guests at the party, the ones who had smiled politely as she slipped out. And then she repeated the line that felt like a spine forming inside her. "This time I speak, and I won't be erased again." The mirror didn't judge. It simply reflected a woman who had finally rediscovered her voice. Ruth chose a Tuesday afternoon, neutral, uneventful, the kind of day when tempers had no reason to be short. She hoped the timing might help. She hoped many things. She set 2 glasses of sweet tea on the coffee table and opened the curtains so the room felt warm, familiar. When she finally sat down on the edge of the sofa, hands folded, she realized she had been listening for the sound of Caroline's car for nearly 20 minutes. It arrived 10 minutes late, then 20, then 30. Caroline stepped in at last, heels clicking crisply on the hardwood, sunglasses still on though the hallway was dim. She carried herself with the practiced poise of a woman raised, not by Ruth, but by Charleston society's invisible scripts. Her hair was immaculate. Her perfume arrived a breath before she did. She didn't apologize for being late. She barely acknowledged the room. "Make it quick, Mom," she said, setting her purse down as if the act were a favor. "I have a dinner later." Ruth inhaled slowly. "Thank you for coming." Caroline didn't sit. She remained standing, arms crossed. "You said it was important." "It is." Ruth gestured toward the armchair. "Please." A pause, just long enough to send a small pulse of pain through Ruth's chest. Then Caroline sat, crossing her legs delicately, her chin tilted with a confidence that felt borrowed from someone else. Ruth began gently. "You hurt me at the party." Caroline didn't blink. "You're too sensitive." Ruth tried again. "I want to understand why. I want to know how we reached a point where you don't see me as what?" Caroline cut in, voice quick, sharp. "A burden? Someone who clings? Someone who never tried to be more than this." She motioned vaguely at the modest living room, at the framed photos, at the softness that made the house feel like home. Ruth held her ground, though her fingers tightened. "Caroline, I gave you everything I had." "And it was never enough," Caroline said, the words landing like stones. "You were never enough." The room went very still. Ruth swallowed once. "Twice. Is that what your father told you? What Patricia tells you?" Caroline leaned forward, eyes flashing. "Patricia taught me to be strong, to expect more from people, to stop settling. You taught me to be weak." The cruelty in the sentence wasn't shouted. It didn't need to be. It was delivered with the clean, effortless precision of someone who had rehearsed it, someone who fully believed it. Ruth felt the blow land deep, not because of anger, not even because of hurt, but because she suddenly understood something she had resisted for years. Her daughter was gone. Not physically, not irreversibly, but the part of Caroline that knew love, the part she had raised with tenderness and lullabies and piano lessons, had been smothered under years of influence, pride, and approval from people who valued utility over heart. Ruth exhaled slowly, letting the realization settle. "Caroline," she said softly, "strength isn't learned by stepping on someone who loves you." Caroline scoffed. "Oh, please, don't make this emotional." "You were emotional once," Ruth replied. "You were kind. You were warm. You held my hand and told me you loved me. Now you look at me like I'm nothing." Caroline stood abruptly. "I don't have time for this." She grabbed her purse and headed toward the door. Ruth followed, not in anger, but with a clarity she had not possessed before. "Caroline," Ruth said, her voice firm enough to make her daughter pause. "I'm done staying quiet." Caroline turned, annoyed. "About what?" Ruth held her gaze, steady and unshaking for the first time in years. "About everything. About what's been hidden. About what's been done. About what you allowed." Caroline frowned, a flicker of uncertainty flashing across her expression. "What are you talking about?" Ruth didn't answer the question directly. Instead, she said the words she had been practicing in the mirror, the ones that would mark the beginning of an entirely different chapter, one not built on silence but on truth. "It's time," she said calmly, "you face the truth." Caroline's posture stiffened. She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again, unable to form a reply. Then she turned and left, the door closing behind her with a finality that felt like the end of something long overdue. Ruth locked the door gently, her hand steady. The next step, she knew, would change everything. The Harrington's anniversary celebration was the kind of event Charleston society adored, lavish, meticulously orchestrated, and designed to impress. The reception hall in Mount Pleasant shimmered with golden lanterns and white hydrangeas, the kind Patricia favored for tastefully understated elegance. The guest list included attorneys, business owners, socialites, and distant relatives who attended simply to be seen. Ruth arrived quietly, slipping into a seat near the back. She almost hadn't come, but some instinct told her she needed to witness what would unfold tonight. The room buzzed with conversation as servers passed trays of champagne flutes. On stage, a slideshow displayed Caroline and Edward through the years. Engagement photos, wedding moments, vacation shots curated to portray the perfect Southern marriage. Caroline stood beside her husband now, radiant in a fitted ivory dress. She leaned toward Patricia, laughing at something her mother-in-law had said. Ruth could see the dynamic clearly from her vantage point. Caroline angled her body toward Patricia rather than her own husband. Patricia, perfectly poised, accepted the attention as her due. When Edward spoke, Patricia touched his arm, not gently but proprietarily, guiding him through conversations, introductions, even where he should stand. Caroline watched with admiration, as if Patricia were the blueprint for every decision worth making. When the microphone was handed over, Patricia stepped forward as if the evening belonged to her. She lifted her glass, her voice crisp, confident. Edward and Caroline embody everything this family stands for: integrity, commitment, and excellence. The crowd murmured approval. Caroline beamed, clinging to every word. "Thank you, Patricia. I wouldn't be who I am without you." Ruth felt the familiar tightening in her chest, but it wasn't pain this time. It was recognition. She was watching a performance she'd been excluded from long before tonight. The speeches continued, Edward thanking his team, Caroline thanking Patricia again, and then, as the applause lulled, a chair scraped sharply across the floor. Julia rose. She wasn't dressed to stand out. Black dress, minimal jewelry, but her presence cut through the room like a blade. She stepped forward with deliberate calm, her jaw set, her eyes fixed on Patricia. "I think there's something everyone here should know," she began, reaching for the microphone before Caroline could stop her. Caroline's smile faltered. "Julia, this isn't—" Julia lifted a hand. "No, it's exactly the right time." The room quieted instantly. Even the servers paused. Julia turned to Patricia, her voice steady, cold. "You talk about integrity, Patricia, but maybe you should explain the accounts you hid under Harrington Consulting, or the debts you funneled into Edward's name before he ever had a chance to review them." A ripple of alarm swept through the guests. Patricia's expression didn't break at first, just tightened, as if refusing to let the mask slip. "That's nonsense," she said softly, but her tone cracked at the edges. Julia pressed on. "Or maybe explain how you forged Edward's signature on loan extensions, or how you used Caroline as a pawn, feeding her approval, grooming her to follow your lead, while pushing her husband deeper and deeper into quiet debt." Caroline stiffened. "Julia, stop." "I'm not finished," Julia replied, turning to the audience. "This family celebrates power and polish, but it comes at a cost. Patricia controls every decision, Edward's, Caroline's, even how they present themselves to all of you. That's not guidance. That's manipulation." Gasps, whispers. A few guests exchanged uneasy glances and stepped back, as though scandal were contagious. Patricia's mask finally cracked. "You insolent little! Tell them the truth," Julia demanded. "Tell them how you threatened to cut Caroline out of the trust if she didn't distance herself from her own mother. Tell them you made her believe Ruth wasn't good enough for this family." Caroline's face drained of color. "Julia, please." For once, Julia said, voice trembling with conviction. "Stop pretending you don't know what's happening to you." Caroline snapped, rage flooding her face. "Shut up, everyone. She's lying. She's jealous. She's trying to ruin this." But the guests weren't convinced. Eyes darted between Patricia and Julia, between Caroline's desperation and Edward's stunned silence. The perfect facade of the Harringtons, so carefully cultivated, fractured in real time. Through it all, Ruth sat still, hands clasped gently in her lap, not triumphant, not shaken, simply steady, because this wasn't her moment to speak. Not yet, but as she watched Caroline unravel, watched Patricia's grip slip, watched the room shift its allegiance, she understood something with bone-deep certainty. The time she had been waiting for was finally here. Everything was cracking open, exactly as truth requires before it can be revealed. The annual Charleston Heritage Founders Gala was the kind of night people whispered about for weeks, where fortunes were displayed, alliances solidified, and anyone who mattered made an appearance. This year, the ballroom at the Charleston Maritime Center gleamed under chandeliers. Every table dressed in navy and gold. Every guest in their finest. The Harrington family, long-standing pillars of the city's business and philanthropic circles, were front and center. Patricia had insisted on it. Edward and Caroline stood beside her like curated ornaments, smiling for photos, greeting donors, projecting the image of a flawless Southern dynasty. A string quartet played near the stage while servers weaved through the crowd with trays of sparkling wine. Ruth arrived unnoticed. Simple navy dress, hair pinned neatly, a tan folder clutched in her hand. No one expected her to be here. No one expected her to approach the stage. No one expected the quiet mother society had always dismissed to be the one who would tear open the truth. But tonight was not about expectations. When the MC finished thanking the sponsors and gestured toward the floor for mingling, Ruth moved, calmly, purposefully, toward the center aisle. At first, no one paid attention. Then a few turned, then a few more, and then an unexpected hush fell across the ballroom, the way the air shifts before a storm breaks. Ruth climbed the steps, and stopped behind the microphone. She did not ask permission. She did not seek approval. She simply lifted the mic and spoke. "Good evening," she began, her voice steady enough to still the remaining whispers. "I'm Ruth Whitmore." Caroline's head snapped up. "What is she doing?" she hissed at Edward. Patricia's eyes narrowed into slits. Ruth held up the folder. "I'm here because I have information this community deserves to know." Patricia stepped forward. "Stop this at once." But Ruth continued as if Patricia were a breeze and nothing more. "For years, Harrington Enterprises has been presented to this city as a symbol of integrity. But integrity is not built on deception, coercion, or forgery." Murmurs swelled. Someone gasped. Edward stood frozen, pale as linen. Ruth opened the folder. Inside was not chaos. It was order, the kind that only truth can shape. She held up the first document. A blown-up projection appeared on the large LED screen behind her as the technician, wide-eyed, switched the feed to the stage camera. "This," Ruth said, "is a wire transfer dated 4 years ago. Money moved from Harrington Consulting into a personal account under Patricia Harrington's name. Amount, $280,000. Purpose line left blank." Patricia's voice cracked. "This is taken out of context." Ruth ignored her and lifted the second document. "This is a forgery. A loan extension signed with Edward Harrington's name, except the signature does not match Edward's own handwriting. I had it reviewed by a handwriting specialist." A stunned silence blanketed the room. Ruth turned another page. "This contract, signed by Caroline Whitmore, authorized a real estate purchase using funds rerouted from the company's charitable foundation." Caroline staggered back. "That's a lie. I never—" Ruth held the page toward the audience, then turned it directly to Caroline. "Your signature is right here," she said. "Page 2, next to Patricia's." The color drained from Caroline's face. Some guests covered their mouths. Others leaned in as if watching a building collapse in slow motion. Patricia stepped forward, her hands shaking, a detail Ruth remembered from the original story and preserved in this retelling. "Ruth, you don't understand what you're doing." "Oh, I understand perfectly." Ruth's voice sharpened, clear enough to cut through the chandelier's glow. "I'm showing the truth that was hidden under polished dinners, staged events, and carefully crafted lies." She placed the documents in a row on the podium. Wire transfers, falsified signatures, internal memos, hidden debt agreements tied to Edward's name. Each paper was a stone. Each stone built a wall the Harringtons could no longer climb. Guests erupted into shouts and questions. "Is this true?" "Edward, did you know?" "Patricia, how could you?" "What about the foundation money?" Security moved uncertainly, unsure whom they were supposed to escort out. Caroline tried again, voice cracking with fury. "These are lies. Everyone knows she's jealous. She's enough." Ruth didn't raise her voice, but the word carried through the hall like a command. She picked up the final page, holding it between 2 fingers. "The last document," she said, "is a list of every attempt made to silence me. Every message, every warning, every time I was told to stay quiet because I wasn't worthy of being part of your perfect story." Patricia's knees buckled slightly. She gripped the nearest chair. Ruth closed the folder slowly. "You tried to erase me, belittle me, replace me." She looked at Caroline, not with anger, but with clarity. "But today," Ruth said, her voice soft but unshakable, "silence speaks louder than any of you." The room fell into stunned chaos. Reporters hurried forward. Donors recoiled. The gala dissolved into frantic whispers and broken alliances. And Ruth, calm, centered, stepped down from the stage as the legacy of the Harringtons cracked open behind her. Tonight had not been her revenge. Tonight had been the truth. The fallout began before the lights at the Charleston Maritime Center had even cooled. By morning, the Harrington name, once a symbol of generational prestige, was splashed across every local broadcast and community newsletter. Words like forgery, fraud, financial misconduct, and foundation misappropriation echoed through the city with the force of a tidal wave. Investigators arrived at Harrington Enterprises before noon. By evening, Edward's office had been sealed. Patricia's records were seized. Caroline's signature appeared on more documents than she could deny. The dynasty didn't crumble quietly. It fractured, loudly, messily, publicly. But Ruth? She stayed silent. She wasn't running interviews. She wasn't relishing the spectacle. She simply tended her small garden, answered the phone when investigators called, and provided copies of whatever they needed. Calm, steady, unshaken. Within weeks, the city understood what had really happened. The Harringtons had built their influence on illusion, and the illusion had finally met a woman who refused to stay erased. When the legal dust settled, Ruth scheduled one final appointment, this time with her own attorney. She sat across from him in a simple blue blouse, the folder from that night resting beside her like an old friend. "I want to make changes to my will," she said. Her attorney, Mr. Walker, nodded gently. "You want to add Caroline?" "No," Ruth's voice remained serene. "I want to remove her." He hesitated, but only for a breath. "All right. And you'd like to designate new beneficiaries?" Ruth pulled out a small list, handwritten steady. "The Whitmore Fund," she said. "A community program supporting single mothers, women rebuilding after abuse, and children who've been told they don't matter." Her eyes softened. "I want my life to mean more than pain." Mr. Walker smiled. "It already does." The paperwork was completed within an hour. When he handed Ruth the finalized documents, she placed them in the folder, the same one that had ended the Harrington Empire. Except now it held something new. Not evidence. Legacy. Caroline arrived 2 days later. She didn't knock gently. The pounding shook the doorframe. Ruth opened it with the same calm she had carried through the storm. Caroline stood on the porch, eyes wild. Her once perfect composure shattered. "You ruined us," she screamed. "Do you hear me? You ruined everything. You destroyed the family." Ruth studied her daughter's face. The desperation, the denial, the inability to see anything beyond her own reflection. The part of her that once would have cried was quiet now, replaced by something steadier. "Caroline," she said softly, "the truth destroyed you, not me." Caroline's voice broke. "You cut me out of your will. How could you do that? I'm your daughter." Ruth didn't flinch. She didn't raise her voice. She simply spoke a truth long overdue. "You gave up being my daughter long before I stopped being your mother." The words settled like dust after a collapse. Inevitable, honest, unchangeable. Caroline staggered back as if struck. For a moment, Ruth thought she might say something real, something human, but instead, Caroline turned and walked away, heels clicking sharply down the steps, disappearing into the bright Charleston afternoon. Ruth closed the door gently. It was the last time she ever saw her. Life did not become loud or triumphant after that. It became peaceful. Ruth volunteered at local shelters, taught young mothers how to budget, how to advocate for themselves, how to break cycles she had once been trapped in. The community grew to love her, not because she exposed a wealthy family, but because she showed up consistently, humbly, wholeheartedly. She no longer avoided mirrors, no longer feared silence, no longer wondered whether she mattered. She did. And every woman she helped became another quiet page in the story she was rewriting for herself. One late afternoon, the Charleston breeze drifted through her open window, carrying the scent of salt and jasmine. Ruth stood near the glass, watching the sunlight fall across the harbor, gold, soft, forgiving. Her reflection shimmered faintly beside the view, not erased, not diminished, simply present. Her voice, low and steady, filled the quiet room. They tried to erase me, but I wrote myself back into the world. And with that, Ruth Whitmore, once silenced, once dismissed, once forgotten, finally stepped into a life that was hers, fully and irrevocably.